day, grade 8s, and the warmest of greetings to our grade 8 Natural Sciences Worksheet Cloud lesson. If you have a question during the lesson, please send an email with your question to grade8@worksheetcloud.com. And I am Mrs. Ernston, the Worksheet Cloud grade 8 Natural Sciences teacher. And I'm so glad that you have returned back to these lessons. And I hope you have remembered to have your notes ready and that you have got something to write with. And if you're new to this lesson, please ensure that you are able to keep a record of the work that we do today, because it is going to help you when you have to answer the worksheets associated with this lesson. So today we're going to have a look at the expansion and contraction of liquids. So you should be able to describe the relationship between heat energy, the movement of particles, and the volume of a substance. You must also use the particle model to explain expansion and contraction of liquids. And we're going to be able to compare the expansion and contraction of liquids, solids, and gases. So in our previous lesson, we have covered solids, and we're going to be having a look at liquids today. So after this lesson, if you need to go and recap on some of your knowledge, please do. So, how does a thermometer work? So a common glass thermometer is called a bulb thermometer. And you can see the bulb thermometer in the diagram over here. They have a fairly large bulb at the bottom connected to this long, thin tube. And sometimes a thermometer has brightly colored liquid inside it. So here you can see the blue liquid, and here this looks like a silvery type of liquid. Some thermometers contain mercury as it expands and contracts quite a lot when it is heated or cooled. So just to draw your attention to the periodic table and our reference to mercury, it is a metal, and the symbol for mercury is capital H lowercase g. So mercury is the only metal on the periodic table that is a liquid at room temperature. I want you to look carefully at the following set of diagrams, and they represent the same thermometer at two different temperatures. So here we have one thermometer and here we have another thermometer, and they have recorded two different temperatures. And here is a scenario of what particles might look like in this liquid here. So, what is the temperature measured on the thermometer to the left? So we go over here. What is that temperature reading? Yes, it is 20 degrees Celsius. The drawing on the right is of the same thermometer, but it is slightly different. Can you tell the difference between these two thermometers? Yes. If you have a look at the temperature reading on the thermometer on the right is 10 degrees Celsius. So which of these circles, A, B, C, or D, is the best representation of the liquid in the thermometer on the right? But you must be able to tell me why you chose that option. So think about it for a little bit, and then we'll go through the answer. So A is indeed the correct answer. Let's figure out why. The lower temperature has made the liquid inside the thermometer contract. So the particles are closer together. So I do want to clear up any misconceptions about expansion and contraction that you may have had in this activity. And let's go and work out why B, C, and D are all incorrect. Okay, answer B is incorrect because the particles are further apart than the diagram on the left. So you compare the particles here and you compare the particles on B. The particles here are close together and the particles here are further apart. So if you pick B, it is possible you are confusing the two concepts of expansion and contraction. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit later. What if you chose option C? So C is incorrect because the actual particles have got bigger. The size of the particle has got bigger. So here the little particle is quite small, and in C the particle is a lot larger. Now, for a particle to get larger, that means it has gained mass. So C is incorrect because the particles in the diagram appear to have grown larger. This is not possible since particles cannot gain mass. Just remember that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So they cannot gain a mass and nor can they gain a volume. Their mass and volume are fixed. So when we speak about expansion, we are speaking about the particles moving apart. So it's not the particles that are getting bigger. It's the spaces between the particles that are getting bigger or getting smaller. D is also incorrect. So if we have a look at D, the particles in the diagram appear to have smaller. So for the same reasons that we've just mentioned in the misconception with C, the spaces between the particles are getting smaller. It's not the actual particles that make up the matter that are getting smaller. So let's just recap some of our content that we have learned. So when liquids are heated, their particles vibrate more rapidly, pushing each other apart slightly, causing this should be liquid to expand. So here we have our particles in the liquid. We start to heat them up, so they start to vibrate. So here our particles are being heated, they start to vibrate, and because of that, they are pushing each other apart. The space there is getting bigger. So here the space there is quite small, there the space there is getting bigger. So when the movement of the particles speeds up, there is an increase in the space between them. So the increase in the space between the particles means that in fact the particle has expanded. So just to recap, the particle is expanded because the particles have moved farther apart. The particles have not expanded, or the substance has not expanded because the particle is getting bigger. So in other words, there is an increase in the volume. The liquid is going to take up more space. Okay, and the amount of increase that this is going to take up is going to depend on the type of liquid. A decrease in the temperature can cause liquids to contract by varying degrees. Okay, so materials can also shrink slightly when they are cooled. So here we've got our substance, and now we're going here and we are cooling the substance. So the movement of the particles is slowing down. Okay, so the particle is not necessarily getting smaller. The particle is staying the same size. Okay, but the way it moves is decreasing. So because the way it moves is decreasing, this space here, as we go from here, as we cool it, the space decreases, it gets less. So that means the space between the particles has decreased and the substance is going to contract. So therefore, in other words, there's going to be a decrease in the space that that liquid has occupied. So there is a relationship between particle movement and volume. So the density of liquids will remain more or less constant, no matter in what container they are placed in. This is because their particles are relatively close together and there are forces of attraction between the particles. Obviously, less forces of attraction when compared to a solid. So what happens when a liquid is heated or cooled? This is the same as giving those particles extra energy or adding energy or taking away energy. They are being provided with less energy. So how is heating or cooling liquids going to affect the packing of the particles and the density? So we have seen the changes in heat energy affect the movement of particles, even if there is no change in state. So we are still dealing with a liquid. We still have the liquid inside the thermometer. So an increase in heat is going to make the particles move faster. So because there are changes in the rate of the movement, that's going to result in a greater volume being occupied. And therefore the liquid is going to move up the thermometer. So consequently, we can see changes in the heat energy because the particles do not change state in a thermometer. Okay, it remains as a liquid. But if we decrease the heat energy, so if the temperature is lowered, the particles are going to move slower. Therefore, the particles are going to move closer together. And we say that the material has contracted. And it's done so because we've cooled the material. So the changes in the rate of particle movement, so the changes in how fast the particles move, is going to result in the volume changing. And that is why when a temperature cools, the liquid in thermometer will contract and the volume will decrease. Therefore, we read on the thermometer that the temperature comes down. So does a material have less mass when it is contracted? Are you able to explain that now? So no, the material cannot have less mass because it is the same number of atoms as before. The mass of the liquid in the thermometer remains constant. We cannot create or destroy this matter. So if the temperature is raised and the thermometer now read 30 degrees, which circle would now best represent the particles in the liquid of the thermometer and why? And our correct answer here is B. Because in answer B would now represent the thermometer at a higher temperature of 30 degrees Celsius, which means we're going to be at 10, and we're going to move up to 20, and we're going to move up to 30. That means the particles have gained energy, therefore the particles are moving faster, therefore the space between the particles is further apart. And then because of that, the liquid is going to expand. Therefore, as the liquid expands, it rises and it will move to a higher degree Celsius. So how does the volume change when a material is heated? And why? So the volume of the material increases because the particles move further apart, and therefore the material expands. So how does the density change when a material is heated? And can you explain your answer? Why? So we have learnt that thinking about matter in terms of the particles inside can often help us understand these interesting phenomena. And if we look at everything that we have studied at matter and material so far, you can see that it all links up and brings us to this point where we found ourselves. So if we are wanting to investigate matter, we're going to use the particle model of matter, and we're going to look at the different phases of solids, liquids, and gases. And we're going to have a look at the arrangement and the movement and the particles in these different states of matter. Then we can also have a look what happens when we add or take away energy to these different states of matter, and what processes do they go through. Then all of this will link up to what happens when we heat or cool a substance in the same state. So it doesn't necessarily change state. So we are staying within a solid, or we're staying within a liquid, or we're staying within a gas, and we are looking at expansion and contraction within that state. And then lastly, this also links up with density, which explains the relationship between mass and volume, and how a substance can be identified according to its density. So we have learned that thinking about matter in terms of particles inside can help us understand all the phenomena we observe around us. So the physical properties of the different states of matter, how the changes from one state of matter to another occur, the relationship of density equaling mass divided by volume, and having a look at expansion and contraction in various solids and liquids and gases. So one good thing to do is try and make your thinking visible, and that is to draw a diagram that you see here. So you can draw a rectangle with a smaller square inside it, and the theme of the square you put in the middle. So the theme of today's lesson was contraction and expansion in liquids. And then what you can do is you can write all the definitions that link up to that. So you can define contraction and expansion and what it means to be a liquid. You can give examples of where we have expansion and contraction in liquids. So for example, in a thermometer. And you can be creative and think out the box. Another example would be, for example, the water in a car's radiator, and what happens when that water heats and cools while the car is being driven. And then you can link that up with any characteristics that link up with contraction and expansion, and you can draw the relationships between the particles. And then lastly, if I have to say the word expansion, contraction, and liquid to you, what color does it make you think of? And can you associate any symbols with this? So if you are able to do this visible thinking diagram, it's going to summarize the expansion and contraction of liquids in one diagram for you, and it will help when you come to study for any tests or exams. So what have you learned today? I would like you to write down 3 things that you've discovered. So 3 new things that you learned about today. And then any 2 interesting facts or details. And can you think of a question that you possibly still have after today's lesson? And if you are not able to answer that question and you need our help, please feel free to send an email with your question to grade8@worksheetcloud.com. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank WorksheetCloud for bringing the lesson for you today. But more importantly, this lesson wouldn't happen if there weren't some awesome grade 8s out there willing and keen and eager to join the lesson. So grade 8s, I really do thank you for joining the lesson today, and I hope that you've learned a lot about expansion and contraction of liquids. I do encourage you to stay tuned to next lesson, because we will be summarizing a lot of the concepts together, and I look forward to seeing you. Bye, grade 8s.